the situation in Ukraine coming up on the second anniversary this weekend. I understand the second anniversary of the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the impact of that. Joining us to give us an update on the latest situation and where this might be heading medium and long term, Professor of International Relations at the University of Otago, Professor Robert Patman. Robert, kia ora, thank you so much for your time today.
Kia ora, Andrew. It's a pleasure.
This is a complicated issue, but in some ways, Robert, that's your specialty, isn't it? If you could give us an update on the current situation on Ukraine, where are things at?
Well, I think we've got to look at it in the round, and that to do that, we have to, first of all, consider what Mr. Putin hoped to achieve with what was hoped to be a blitzkrieg incursion into Ukraine. Mr. Putin was ambitious. He wanted to take over the entire country, and he wanted to decapitate the leadership of Ukraine and also remove it from the capital, Kyiv. Now, he failed in that initial thrust. For a while, he controlled about 50% of the country, but the Ukrainians had a successful counteroffensive in the last quarter of 2022, and they've reclaimed about 50% of the territory they lost. That leaves the Russians hanging on, or occupying is probably a better way of putting it, the eastern part of the country, about 20% of Ukraine's territory, and Ukraine is a big country. So Mr. Putin hasn't really achieved what he wanted to achieve. It's been very expensive. It's widely, I think, reported that Russia's lost more than 200,000 troops. And but to balance the picture, I think the much expected and vaunted Ukrainian counteroffensive, which began in June last year, didn't really make the sort of breakthrough that many expected. And I suppose Russia has begun to claw its way back recently because of problems relating to the support of Ukraine. Ukraine's major backer has been the United States, but domestic problems in the United States have reduced American funding for the Ukrainians' efforts to repel and expel the Russian troops in their country. So we've had a situation recently, a settlement called Adiivka, which had a population of about 30,000 before the war. It's of no huge strategic significance, but it did give Mr. Putin, they managed to, after about 5 months of siege and at the cost of 30,000 Russian troops, they did manage to seize that settlement. So that can be seen as a win going into the March election for Mr. Putin.
I mean, the timing of that is the timing of that is quite strategically important for Putin, of course. And when we look at the campaign, the much vaunted summer offensive amounted to very little, and given how much territory Ukraine had got back previously, was expected to continue at that rate, and we've seen nothing like it. Winter, of course, in this part of the world brings its own problems. Adding to that, a dwindling munitions supply for Ukraine in this regard, or at least uncertainty as to supply of munitions. A difficult end to the winter campaign, but it's worked out well in some ways for Putin. The fall of Adiivka just before the elections.
Yes, that's a gain, but we've got to keep a sense of perspective about this conflict. At the cost of 30,000 troops, or that's what it's been reported to be, from quite reliable sources. For example, the study of the Institute for the Study of War. Russia has never been candid about the number of losses it's taken, but that advanced their position about 5 kilometers. So the Ukraine, in retrospect, we can always be wise after the event. In retrospect, Ukraine probably was wrong-headed and badly advised to try and launch a counteroffensive on a 1,000-kilometer front against deeply entrenched Russian defensive positions. They've now changed their strategy. The commander of the army has been replaced, and Zelensky's government now is going for asymmetrical warfare. which small states often do tend to do against much bigger states. What does that mean? Essentially, targeting key parts of the Russian infrastructure to erode their capacity to wage war.
Yeah. So drone attacks on petroleum installations,
strikes
those sorts
deeply
of things.
into Russia, even St. Petersburg oil refinery. And they're having quite a lot of success. They sunk a major Russian warship in the Black Sea. This is a country without a navy, has cut the Russian presence by a third. In the last week, they've shot down 7 fighter aircraft of Russia at a cost of about $350 million to Russia. I'm not convinced Russia's in a position to fight a long war. It's getting generous support from the likes of Iran and North Korea in terms of munitions and drones. But the Russian economy is much smaller than some of the countries backing Ukraine. And it's a question of, the other thing is there's been signs of discontent within Russia. We had the Prigozhin coup. I'm not convinced there won't be other attempts against Putin's leadership, particularly after the death of the major opposition leader, Navalny.
Yes. Now, we will more on that in just a moment, but I suppose just wanting to look at Ukraine's position because, well, certainly some fudging, some blurring around the edges when it comes to US support. US, of course, not the only ally, but certainly in terms of volume, giving the most financial and military aid to Ukraine, which, well, arguably has allowed it to to regain as much territory previously. That is in question, especially with the US elections coming up as to whether or not that will hold. Is there enough support from NATO, from other allied nations in Europe to support Ukraine, or will this turn into a...
Theoretically there is. And there are signs, particularly in light of Navalny's death, that Europe's now stepping up. I mean, Germany has been reluctant to provide long-range missiles to Ukraine. This is something, by the way, which is a little bit baffling, that both the United States and key players like Germany's the second biggest provider of heavy weaponry after the United States. They've tried to have a balancing act, trying to keep Ukraine in the war rather than actually winning it. And that's a bit baffling. But I think after Navalny's death, I think Europe is really coming to terms more dramatically than before, just what a sort of regime Mr. Putin operates. And I think there's a recognition that if Ukraine's defeated, the conflict won't stop with Ukraine. So what we've had in the last 2 weeks is several remarkable developments. The EU contributing 50 billion euros to the Ukrainian war effort. There is now speculation that America, after Navalny's death, may support the unfreezing of $300 billion of Russian assets and make them available to Ukraine. And Denmark, in a remarkable gesture, has made their entire military stockpile available to Ukraine. And New Zealand yesterday announced about $26 million worth of additional military and humanitarian support. So I think many countries are recognizing now that America can't be relied on in the election year. And, and I think, so theoretically, other countries can step up.
Ukraine, of course, got its own challenges, as you mentioned, a change in the military leadership, but all sorts of concerns about corruption within the government. This, is, in some ways, is a blockade to full NATO membership for Ukraine. Would that be a game changer? And is it likely, if Ukraine were to become a NATO member, would that bring the end of this conflict closer, in your opinion?
I think NATO's not going to make a decision about that until Russia's been defeated. And, many countries, including our own, have a huge stake in the defeat of Putin's attempt to grab this land. If Mr. Putin succeeded, it could have destabilizing consequences around the world, because it would be giving green light to the idea that power, rather than principles, determines international boundaries. And I think many people are uncomfortable with that.
Certainly appreciate your wisdom and insight as always, Robert. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.